Thank you for coming to this late session. I think some people might be coming after we start, because some sessions are running late. My name is Nicola Zingales. I'm a professor at FGV, Fundação Getúlio Vargas in Rio de Janeiro. And I'm also here as a partner of CPDP. We are hosting every year CPDP Latam in Rio. So in case you want to do some more tropical experience of CPDP, please come and join us. I'm starting this discussion on AI sovereignty from the global majority. We have a fantastic lineup and a lot of things to say. But first of all, I wanted also to mention, how do I pass the slides? Okay.
The green.
Thank you. That we have just launched a book on digital sovereignty and AI from a Brazilian perspective. It's in Portuguese. You can access it. It's freely available. And we'll soon launch the English version. So here, I want to start by giving just a highlight, very quick sense of what we're talking about in this book, and relates this to the presentations and comments that will follow. First of all, I think an important concept, since here we are talking about sovereignty, is what we mean. You know, it's a word that has been floating around in the conference a lot, and people mean different things when they talk about it. We will have a chance to discuss this. But I think we can recognize that many people, at least, are talking about sovereignty no longer in the Westphalian sense that the state, has control over its population, its territory, but it's more shifting into the perspective of a bottom-up sovereignty. So sovereignty belongs to the people, and we should maybe try to discuss how we can empower people to have control over technology. This includes also some duty for the state to create the conditions so that people can have effective control, not just in the sense of regulating and restraining the use of technology, but also understanding technology and knowing how to develop technology, which is an important component for a local ecosystem, for a country to develop its own technological autonomy. So this actually is a duty, according to the Brazilian constitution, that is enshrined in the law, and the state has a duty to promote technological autonomy in Brazil and encourage the development and strengthening of innovation. So this, I think, gives an advantage, as we discuss in this book, to Brazil when it comes to the policies that must be enacted to promote these values. And in this book, we discuss a systemic approach that first of all, goes beyond mere law. As law and technology scholars know, we have various forces of regulation. In addition to the law, we have code, we have societal norms, and we have economic incentives. And here we discuss a bit of that, and we discuss also systemic approach in the sense of a stack approach. So different elements that are necessary. You cannot focus on just one element in the stack to promote real technological autonomy. And this goes in tandem with a development of an industrial policy, which means the building, but also creating incentives for the development of technology. So taxation can also be involved as part of that, and we have a discussion paper on it, but that is a different question, a different conversation. Now I want to switch over to our panelists. First of all, we will hear from Cecilia Ricap, who is research director and professor of economics at UCL, where she leads the Institute for Public Purpose. Then we will switch to Divij, who is a research fellow at the ODI Global in London. Then we have Melody Musoni, who is a policy analyst at ECDPM, European Center for Development Policy, right? Then there is Sebastiano Stofaletti, who is Secretary General of the Digital SME Alliance. So a quite range of perspective. And so I'm really keen to hear the discussion on this. Let's start then with Cecilia to my left.
Okay, hi everyone, good afternoon. And I'm going to try to frame this conversation and then give you some insights into how digital dependence manifests in Latin America, and also a bit about what could be done from Latin America, given the purpose of this talk, which is to talk from the global majorities, the global south, peripheral countries. So first, framing, who rules? And who rules is who rules capitalism ultimately, and how these companies are, big tech in particular from the US, have built a coalition with Donald Trump, but also since before with the US government, to control beyond ownership. And the same can be said of China clearly, and its Chinese big tech. So when we say control beyond ownership, this means that these corporations that sit at the core of capitalism have a capacity to mobilize the knowledge and also steer the knowledge that is developed by thousands of others. I've just been at a panel where we discuss precisely the effect it has at the university. So now I want to focus on how they also control other companies, to also open a bit the floor to Sebastiano afterwards, discussing about SMEs. And this is, for instance, by 2024, the network of startup companies that were receiving private investment, so corporate venture capital money from Google, NVIDIA, Amazon, and Microsoft. We can clearly see here thousands of companies that produce knowledge, that contribute to innovation, that are many allegedly at the knowledge frontier, but that they will always be, from the very beginning up to the end, subordinated to big tech companies, dependent not only on this funding, but also, and here not only these thousands, but even many more, and even governments, as I will say in 1 second, dependent on their cloud. When Nicolo was introducing the discussion about of their book and how to take this ecosystemic stack perspective, the more I research about the cloud, the more I start thinking that the cloud is the stack. Because basically, the material place, and the economic place where the stack becomes real is through the cloud. Not only because the cloud is infrastructure as a service, but the cloud is also software as a service, data as a service, models as a service, you name it. It's actually a supermarket of digital technologies. No matter what you are producing, it will sooner or later become offered as a service on either Amazon, Microsoft, and or Google Cloud, which concentrates 65% of the market globally. So in places like Europe, the concentration is even higher. And this is not just a supermarket in the sense that we know supermarkets in our cities, because the supermarkets in our cities actually sell things that were not produced inside the supermarket. And once we buy those things, we leave the supermarket and consume them elsewhere. This doesn't happen with the cloud. The cloud is at the same time the place where the digital technologies are produced, exchanged, and consumed, which gives a panopticon power, a panopticon view to these companies that have no parallel. And they use it to actually, on purpose, split their services in countless of pieces, those that they offer themselves, but also those of their quote-unquote partners that are also subordinated to their rules and their way of organizing this space. Here, for instance, you have an example of how developers have these sort of cheat sheets to remember the different types of services that are available on AWS. So this, of course, generates problems that cannot just be solved, for instance, with interoperability, because it's interoperability of thousands of services what would need to be built. This, to make it even clearer, this is Netflix. What we see on our screens is actually this very complex network of thousands of services. Part of this developed by Netflix, but most of this purchased as a service on Amazon, Microsoft, or Google, on Amazon Cloud, actually. And it also has a bit of Google, but mostly Amazon Web Services. So this panopticon, which is not about how the companies look into the data that is stored there, I'm not claiming that. I'm saying that they are capable of looking at the metadata, the data that we generate when we use these services. This gives the companies a huge power that has only been expanding with AI. AI is the best marketing strategy they could have asked for. They've been developing AI. They've been at the center of the research network pushing for this type of AI, but also they are not the only ones producing AI. Still, sooner or later, even Meta ends up depending on the cloud or on the cloud offerings or cloud spaces of these few companies. So the dependence on the cloud ends up being so large that it also includes governments. And here you have the UK, which usually wouldn't be seen as part of the global majority. Not only the UK is dependent, but also governments around the world are dependent. And this dependence has a political chapter. Because also, and in particular since Donald Trump, we've seen a push for eliminating every sort of regulation, not even thinking of levying taxes, which results from the coalition between big tech companies and Donald Trump. And this has had already effects in countries from the classical peripheries, but also in Europe, with the decision to postpone the enforcement of the AI Act. And the political dependence also affects what is promoted. If you want to be a friend of the US, you need to adopt US AI and cloud technologies. If you want to be part of the digital economy, what governments can do is digital public infrastructure, which actually are digital services, because the true digital infrastructure remains in the hands of the companies. And on top of all this, because of the AI hype, but not only, the other thing that governments around the world can and should do, according to the companies, of course, is to have promotional data center regimes so that they can keep on extracting natural resources, electricity, water from all around the world, which will be put at the service of their data capture and also their knowledge capture. So a form of what I describe as twin extractivism. So to conclude here, let me say a few words about digital sovereignty. Digital sovereignty these days is not about territory. Having a data center from a Microsoft, Amazon, Google in our territories will actually represent a further extraction of natural resources without significant creation of jobs, no positive structural economic transformation. And on the other hand, it will be using electricity and water that can actually be used for other things. If we think in terms of nationality, for instance, Magalu from Brazil offers cloud services. Magalu purchases part of its infrastructure on big tech companies. So it's not enough to have this sort of facade of a national solution to think that the problem is solved. This is not a problem ultimately or not exclusively about the nationality of the technology or the companies. This is a problem of governance and democracy. Speaking of digital sovereignty requires political imagination, because we need to think about how we can combine an expansion of democracy at the international level that is also public-led and that at the same time embraces popular power, people's power to decide what technology we have, what technology we don't want to have, what data should be harvested, what data shouldn't be harvested, for what uses, how we will be using it. And this also needs to be considered for the case of data centers. So where to start? And I finish here. I think we need to start because, of course, it cannot be, this is a very complex and comprehensive problem, and the degree of dependence is huge. I think that we need to start by the public sector. We cannot hope or expect that the governments will regulate these companies effectively if they are dependent on these companies. And we can start small. We can start by thinking of sensitive sectors within the public administration, like education, where the adoption of the generative AI models that these companies develop undermine kids and people in general capacity to think, for instance. So the urgency of developing solutions go beyond the discussions about sovereignty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecilia, for triggering our imagination about how we can give back some control. I think it's extremely interesting to provide concrete data about what is the current situation, and in your book you have much more on that, so I think this is very useful input for the discussion. Now transitioning to Divij Joshi, who has also a PhD level knowledge about digital sovereignty, as was part of his studies. And he can tell us a little bit about particularly the Indian perspective in this discussion. Thank you, Josh.
Sure, thanks so much. And I might be whispering a little bit because I have a sore throat, sorry about that. So yeah, I thought I might give a breakdown of looking at the Indian perspective to really break down why digital sovereignty or AI sovereignty is becoming a phenomena that is kind of all over and in so many conversations here. how it's being instantiated specifically in the Indian context to kind of break down the practices of digital sovereignty and the narratives behind digital sovereignty, and what that can tell us about how state power is being projected in the digital age and over AI. And finally, brief discussion maybe of what the implications of these specific narratives and practices and this new role of the state over the information economy or the digital world means. Again, looking from the kind of Indian perspective, which has a fairly long history of thinking about digital sovereignty. The first time I came about it was maybe 2017. So it's been a space which is interesting to observe from a policy perspective for its longevity and the ways in which it has tracked more global concerns. So why digital sovereignty, right? I think that, I understand sovereignty as a projection of state power into the information economy. And it is fundamentally about, it is fundamentally about a shifting role of the state. That's most of the conversations we've been having. It should ideally be, as both speakers before me have mentioned, a little bit more about people and a little bit more about democratic participation or sovereignty of the self. But by and large, practices of sovereignty have largely been about the state trying to grapple with what it sees as dependencies, cross-national dependencies, and how that affects both the economic sovereignty as well as national security of the state. And this is true for India as well, that the why behind sovereignty has come up as a reaction to the recognition of the strategic importance of certain digital technologies. And so that's shifted, whether it was platforms earlier or cloud, it's now shifted onto the strategic importance of AI as a kind of epistemic knowledge infrastructure that's going to power the next generation of the information economy. It's also responsive to shifting geopolitics. I think the great power divide between the US and China and their specific control over the AI stack that's been mentioned as well is really one of the core driving forces behind why sovereignty has come up again and again within Indian policy discourses and practices. And so that's particularly the case for, the post-DeepSeek narratives on sovereignty that were being driven by this national security consensus in the Indian condition, in the Indian context. But also this idea of moving up the value chain for the AI economy, right? And talking about the kind of structural effects and historically linking back to the structurally unequal footing in the value chain that not only India, but most of the global South has been placed in or positioned in the global information economy. And so sovereignty has also been this idea of trying to move up and secure a better footing in the global value chain of artificial intelligence. And that's why, besides the national security domain, it has this kind of industrial policy focus of trying to make a globally competitive, as well as domestically competitive market. Now, how is this playing out, right? I think through this history, we've seen a bunch of different changes as to how sovereignty has been conceived of and practiced. Maybe 5-6 years ago, it was mainly this idea of localization through the territorialization of data centers. So we're sovereign if we have, clouds, factories or like data centers within our own territory, and we can exert some kind of jurisdictional control over it. That bit has weakened a little bit. It's now turned to this idea of trying to build a domestic and competitive AI ecosystem. And so very much shifted towards an industrial policy focus of sovereignty as a projection of economic security. This has happened through providing subsidized inputs like data or compute to a local industrialists. It has meant brokering investments with big tech through the promotion of national champions. The idea here being that if a Google comes in and works with a Reliance Jio, which is the big kind of national champion being projected here, that there can be some cross-fertilization of knowledge and innovation practices there, although the evidence for this may be quite limited. It also looks like privileging domestic manufacturers and the creation of appropriate technologies like multilingual LLMs, often done through structuring the state's role as being making the state quite central in things like procurement practices or market shaping opportunities, for example, through regulations on foreign direct investment within the country as well. What it hasn't done, and which is quite important for this other perspective of sovereignty, is something that's quite important from a perspective of autonomy and individual or community autonomy. It's not looked like thinking about governance. It's not looked like thinking about safety within AI systems. It's not really considered the regulatory dynamics of artificial intelligence, how it might protect important values and rights like privacy or human dignity or autonomy. It's also not looked like protections for workers or consumers, which are a big part of this global value chain, a big part of why, in fact, the kind of structural role of the Global South in the AI value chain has been so detrimental to its people because it comes without worker protections, it comes without consumer protections. It's historically been quite extractive, and unfortunately, this doesn't necessarily shift those extractive natures. It only localizes it, which is quite unfortunate. And so the third part of this, the third kind of part of my intervention, I wanted to think about what the implications of this particular model of sovereignty could mean. Because this model of sovereignty is highly centralized, it's highly hierarchical, it presents a very specific vision of what AI means for the economy. It is not participatory, it's not necessarily democratic, right? And the way I see it going is that this particular model of digital sovereignty or AI sovereignty, at least in India, is really entrenching a specific form of extractivism, right? A specific extractive political economy of the information economy, which we've seen from the platform era and the big tech era onwards. And it's simply kind of mapping that extractive information economy onto local big tech, right? Or to local players, or to kind of centralize the role of the state in brokering these large-scale extractive industries and information practices. And this is because the kind of discussions, the narratives as well as the practices around digital sovereignty are seen, they're projected as responses to globally inequitable practices and value chains, which is absolutely true, but they don't in themselves have any inherent normative value. They don't have any normative valence behind thinking about the reclaiming of state power in this unequal world. And so my final kind of thought would be that if we want to progress behind this, we need, as Cecilia has already mentioned, we need an actual progressive vision for what digital sovereignty could look like, beyond just being a reactionary vision to saying that the Global South has been structurally left out of value in the AI value chain. We need to present a democratic and participatory vision which comes with shared values, which comes with a different look at what has caused the kind of deep-rooted extractive practices of the information economy and how we might turn that over. And maybe we can get to, I have some thoughts on how we might do that, and we can get to that later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. I think, yes, we might pick up some of these points, particularly when you emphasize basically a double binary that on one hand is redistribution of value, both at the level of states that need to be leveled up from the Global South, but also in terms of who is capturing the value in the ecosystem. And also you have a democratic component. So I think this is a discussion for the agenda of sovereignty, which one should be the most important focus, or should we prioritize one of these elements? I think that's very interesting point. Okay, now moving on, we will hear a little bit from Melody on the African perspective, particularly. She has done a lot of work on the region and some countries also in Africa that have a quite interesting strategy. So Melody, please, without more, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I guess what I can share is just the broader developments at the African Union level, and then try to draw examples of what's happening at national level in terms of who is doing what, especially on AI development in Africa. And I think when we talk about AI sovereignty within the African context, I think that conversation, so before when we used to talk about digital sovereignty, there was a lot of emphasis on issues around data localization, mainly because policymakers were didn't understand what the data economy actually means, and they didn't understand how to go about in terms of regulating the data space and actually creating or leveraging the value that comes out of data. So the conversations before around digital sovereignty were really mainly on, we need to localize data, we should not share data. But I think over the years, as we continue to engage a lot with our policymakers, we started to see that shift from this strict approach to issues around data localization to being open up and having more clear and understanding of what the data economy actually means. And then that also shaped how African countries actually see the issues around sovereignty, especially now with artificial intelligence. And for Africans, it's also understanding that we are coming into a space where there is so much geopolitical competition. We talk about the AI race, for example. As Africans, we are not there yet. We still have to focus on issues around digital infrastructure. So for most African countries, the issue of AI sovereignty is really about how do we extract value from AI? What are the benefits that come with us using this technology? So you hear a lot of discussion around how can we build homegrown AI solutions which can actually address African problems. So we want to be in a position where we have Africans at the lead of innovation, coming up with solutions that can actually address our African problems. And I think there is that a general understanding of, we know what our strengths are, we know what our weaknesses are. So how can we leverage both to create opportunities for us in this AI ecosystem? So maybe to start off with, when it comes to issues around data, for the longest, I know people used to talk about equating data to new oil or data as new gold conversation. That didn't really resonate a lot with Africans. But then when you started comparing data to soil, to land, they were able to understand, to say, actually, data is the new soil. Understand that you need to have ownership of your land. You need to extract value from your land. And if you are to distribute land, you need to make sure that you distribute land to local citizens or local stakeholders so they can extract value that actually benefits the country. So those conversations started to give a different picture of what we mean when we are talking about creation of data, of value through data. And some of the conversations that we currently have now is issues around the how part of how do we actually create this economic value out of data, and questions around who is actually going to benefit from the data that is going to be derived from or generated from African communities. So you see, I did a project last year where we were looking at how AI is actually being the kind of innovations that are emerging in 3 priority sectors in Africa: in agriculture, in education, and in health. And what we found from those discussions or from those interviews and research was that a lot of benefit was going to the private sector and the big tech. There wasn't a lot of benefit that was actually coming to local communities. And it's a big issue when we start thinking about, what does sovereignty mean? Does it mean that creating economic value that benefits foreign actors, or it's really about creating economic value and opportunities for local communities? I can give an example. We were looking at how innovation in the agriculture space, and talking to researchers who were working in that space. They were saying they get a lot of funding to go and do field work and to do data collection. Who is in the field? It's usually farmers. So they go to smallholder farmers, they plead with them to do data collection, because some of the data sets they need require high resolution images. So if you're a farmer, they come to you and say, well, we want to come up with a solution that deals with, say, early detection of pests, for example. So this is going to benefit you. So you need every day to take photos of your crops and you upload on the system. So of course, when you explain that to a farmer and they actually understand what their needs are, They are happy to do the work, but you're exploiting them at the end of the day. And then you come up with a solution, you sell it to the highest bidder. What is the value that is coming to these communities? So these are some of the real life challenges that when we think about AI sovereignty, those are issues that African countries are actually thinking to say, what does that actually mean when we are talking about sovereignty? We don't want to just have laws for the sake of laws to say, well, we're going to regulate AI. What exactly are we regulating? And what value do our communities actually get from it? And then the issue of data centers, I think my colleagues have already shared about this, especially when it comes to hosting of some of these data centers. There is still a lot of resistance to say, yeah, we still want to promote strict data localization. We want to have data centers in our countries. But then when you sit down and talk to policymakers about the reality of what the data market looks like and the reality of where they are as a country, sometimes it doesn't make sense for them to insist on data localization, or even if it means liberal data localization, which allows them to share data. So how these conversations are now are shifting is we are now talking more about maybe one country does not necessarily need to have data centers in the country. How about we think about having regional clouds? How about we think about sharing, maybe it's the SADC region, which consists of 16 member states. How about we create data centers that can benefit everyone from the region? And we are talking about data embassies. You treat these data centers the same way you treat our data embassies. So that way, you don't necessarily need to rely on foreign actors to provide you with cloud services, but rather you still have more data centers in Africa. And I think it's a legit issue and a legit reason to focus more on data centers, because when you look at the data center market, the global one, Africa only contributes 2%. There are about 250 data centers across Africa. And these are also concentrated in South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, and Morocco. Everywhere else, there are no data centers. So there are definitely issues around how do we go about in terms of building some of these data centers, promoting AI sovereignty, but also understanding the realities of where we are as a continent. And I'm not sure how I'm doing on time.
It's over, but you can finalize.
And then maybe another point just on data, I can always come back to the discussion. There is usually a misconception that there is no data in Africa. That is not true. There is actually a lot of data. The problem is that the data is sitting with international actors, be it development partners or be it the private sector. And we actually saw that when USAID left Africa, for example, they had a lot of health data they had. And African governments had to go again to start to want to negotiate to get their data back. It didn't mean that there is no health data in Africa. It's there, but it's being hosted by someone else. So those questions around AI governance, data governance become critical, understanding who actually has sovereignty over this data. And maybe another example that I can also give is with the private sector. I think it was in 2023, 2024, WorldCoin, the company owned by Sam Altman, they actually went to Kenya and they were collecting biometric data of Kenyans, and in return they were giving them for an equivalent of $48 US in crypto assets. And this was a massive project they were doing. And then when you start looking at the value they are getting from that exercise and that project itself, it was not fair for Kenyans. So just to end the conversation in Africa, really it's about how do we position ourselves in a way that the innovations in AI or data that is being generated in Africa, it actually leads to opportunities, real opportunities for Africans, and not just a matter of coming up with regulation. And then I can always come back and share some of the policy developments that are also taking shape in the continent. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Melody. Very interesting examples. just a note that the WorldCoin also happened in Brazil, and the Data Protection Authority prohibited requests to stop this sale of data. They were selling for about $100, so a little bit more, but still people were giving it very cheap. Now, one maybe in the discussion want to hear more about these regional approaches, because also this concept of data embassy is an interesting one. I wonder what are the implications in terms of taxation of this data and how the countries would agree on that. But now let us move to the last opening remarks by Sebastiano Tofaletti.
Yes,
please.
Thank you.
I wonder if you can bring the small and medium-sized business perspective.
Yes, I will try. And as I am the last, I will also try not to make such of a introductory statement, but rather react to what I heard. So we kind of start the conversation, because I think it's about time we discuss. On the problem statement that I heard from the colleagues, I think I will obviously totally agree. I mean, I've been advocating for tech sovereignty in Europe for more than a decade, and even before it was something people were talking about. So I'm glad to hear that now these discussions are really, becoming popular. Now we are an association of essentially alternative technology providers, representing more than 45,000 SMEs, tech SMEs in Europe. So it's kind of natural for us to believe that another technology market must be possible. Now, of course, I would say I totally agree with things I heard. Cecilia insisted that AI is the Trojan horse, and I think we all see what you mean there. I think is a very nice way to put it. The point on the central role of the cloud computing, of course, this is something people are also understanding. Finally, after we have been treating, we Europeans, and I believe in the other regions as well, we Europeans have been treating technology as a commodity for, let's say, 2 decades. It is now, I hope it is now over. I hope we now understand that technology is power. And the center of technology, of course, I agree with you, is cloud computing. Now, obviously, we should not make the mistake of believing that because we build data centers, we are replacing the US hyperscalers cloud computing. What they have is not just the metal, the hardware. What they have is a very large ecosystem of services which run on top of their cloud computing, which is really the value. If you only build data centers or computers, as, by the way, Europe has been doing, because of the funding we have seen in the last few years, has been, okay, build data centers, build computers, as if this was the solution. You cannot switch away from AWS or Azure to a European computer just because you have the computer. It's not the way it works. You need a lot of services, as Cecilia rightly showed in the picture. And I like very much the concept of this extractive US hyperscaler-centered business model, where we, the Europeans, our SMEs or our startups, take the risk of innovation and then end up in the gravity, in the orbit of this infrastructure owned by big tech, where they essentially get extracted their value because they pay commissions wherever they use it. Ultimately, they end up either being in competition or being bought straight after they do the exit. And so it is not a good model for a country to try, for a region to try to succeed only in that layer, in the application layer, because ultimately you don't retain the value. And that, by the way, explains very well what Draghi says, that Europe is in a gap, productivity gap with the US. There is no productivity gap in any sector with the US. There is only a big productivity gap in the ICT sector. Why? Because they own the infrastructure on which our digital economy runs. I think it's becoming pretty obvious, and I'm glad now people understand these topics. So to come to mind, the point I want to make is also what is then possible? What can we do? Because I think we have to look into solutions. We have an idea which we think works very well, not only in Europe, but in the rest of the world, which is the problem is not technology per se. Technology is not bad. Technology is there to solve problems of the people, problems of the world, problems, etc. However, what we have today is a situation where technology is only there to make a few billionaires richer and richer. Am I wrong? So we believe the problem is not technology, the problem is the market that we have at the moment, the monopolistic market that we have. So if we can get democracy in the market, then ideally we will get a democratic technology. That's, I think, the first problem we have to solve. Now, how do we make that possible? In Europe, what we can do is to build technology, build the stack. We have to talk about the stack. We have to build the stack, not just by imitating the Silicon Valley business model, which is, okay, create the champion that will do everything. But because we don't have that and because it's probably not too difficult and too costly to do it, what we have is a lot of smaller companies, smaller startups, champions which are hidden, which each of them builds solutions which are components of the stack. And if we can bundle all of them, build packages, okay, then we can create our own stack. And the beauty of this model is that it is built on interoperability, so you can change every single component of the stack. If one component fails, you can replace it with another one, with an equivalent one. So it creates competition, it creates development, and it is also much more resilient. Because if Iran bombs an AWS center in an Arab country, then all the services are down. But if we build the stack on federation interoperability, one single data center is going to be replaced by another one. So it's not a problem. And when we go to, let's say, the global south or other countries, the model is very nice because now the Commission has been championing something they call the EU Business Tech Offer, right? Which some of us know what they mean. It's been spoken about in the so-called international digital strategy. What we are telling the Commission is that this EU Tech Offer should be a package, a stack built by European solutions, which we offer to the rest of the world. And the beauty of it is that it creates development. Why? Because if we go to, let's say, an African country with our stack of solutions, it's not a one single monolith. It's a combination of components where the African country or the African region may have their own components. So they may not want to take A to Z. They will take only a few and they will use their own. And when they develop their own, they will replace the European ones with their own. So we create a sustainable development for the partner countries. This is obviously, not what really our policymakers are thinking about now, because when they think about the EU Business Tech Offer, they think, we will take the large European companies, let's say Ericsson, Nokia, or a few others to Africa, and we will have them to sell. Sorry, but they don't have the stack. They only have one single component, and what we need to create is the stack, because what our African partners need is somebody to essentially offer an alternative to the US stack or the Chinese stack. So Europe can do it, and we are actually doing it. However, we have to change the narrative. We have to change the way we think about what kind of model of technology we want to export. And I will conclude there.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Now we have about 35 minutes. So I suggest we do first a couple of questions from myself to you to just understand a bit more your position on certain topics, and then we open it up for a broader debate. So since you mentioned the stack, I would ask the colleagues there to show, I have a slide on the stack, and it's precisely, complementing some of your points, because when you say we export the stack and it's a modular framework, it's a good idea, but one element that often is neglected in this is that it's not just about technology stack. There's also European regulation that comes with it and will make it more attractive, perhaps because it promotes some values that can be more widely shared. So I think we need to have also a look at other elements that in this stack I would put that, for instance, include digital literacy. No, the next, please. Well.
You can do it.
Right. I forgot. No. I guess this was the screenshot.
Yes,
okay, perfect. Okay.
Right there.
Yes. Okay. So yeah, we've talked about technology stack, but often there is also the problem of data, that is used to train AI. So who has access to it, under what conditions? Do we have a law that enforces data protection correctly? Do you have also open data framework that would allow to get access to public data, not personal, for these purposes? What do you do for developing the software, the algorithms, and the model? And here in Brazil, for instance, we had inconsistent policy over the year. We didn't have a clear vision on how to stimulate, particularly the development. So there was a push for open source in the first Lula government, 2000, but it was mainly about using open source in the government, and this was not about fomenting the development of further open source technology. So this is also an important element. Of course, computational capacity will be part of the stack without doubts. Meaningful connectivity is something that in the Global South can be problematic. Particularly, something that we should mention is we have zero rating plans that are used to favor certain applications. And especially in the Global South, we are talking about the meta applications, WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram. And, this puts some criticism to the policies that, we are expanding access and connectivity to everyone, but it's not necessarily equal, if certain players have an advantage. Then, as part of the stuff, of course, electrical power and access to raw materials. And here, for instance, Brazil has an advantage because it has a lot of natural resources that can be used to foment more use, more adoption, more training of AI. And well, here you could also put the data centers. We had, for instance, in Brazil, a decree that encouraged the establishment of data centers by creating very good tax incentives. And one of the selling points is also, no, but this is not harming the environment that much because we can use clean energies to keep the data centers cold. And not every country has this advantage, and so perhaps in importing the stack, you can focus on what are the comparative advantage that country has that can build upon. Digital literacy remains a problem. Not everybody has the skills, and especially nowadays, we do a lot of training for the new generations, but there are a lot of old generations that are actually those that make the policies that operate on a daily basis, and that they don't have this competence to use, control, and effectively develop AI. Cybersecurity, not in all Global South jurisdiction, you have an effective framework. In Brazil, this is just beginning. And as part of that, I would also add a policy against risk to prevent, risks from happening, which goes beyond cybersecurity. We have now, with AI, platform governance, we have a broader approach to risk regulation. And this is important to understand how to have situational awareness, how the countries can react to threats that are coming and can undermine the effectiveness of AI development. So with all that stack, I wanted to maybe throw to you a couple of questions. First, what do you think about it? If you think that some elements are more important than others, but particularly also we discussed a lot about cloud, the importance of cloud. Of course, it's a central element. And I wanted to hear from you, what do you think that a good procurement and development policy for the cloud in one country should be? what kind of element of sovereignty by design we should incorporate when the state wants to get cloud services, what kind of elements you would put in there. This just to start the conversation. Who wants to take it?
If you want, I can
Okay,
go, but I will ask also, since you have the slides, if you can put mine, because I will also go to my final one to illustrate the Latin American stack. And no, I wanted to start with also reflecting on different parts of the stack. The first part is data centers. I usually use, instead of embassy, I use a military base. So for me, a data center of a foreign company or any company that operates privately without enabling any sort of actual auditing or access to the data for a government should be treated as a foreign country military base. It doesn't generate jobs, it consumes a lot of electricity and water. Even if it claims to be using clean energy, there are priorities in terms of the use of clean energy, and these are clearly not data centers. Like a public transport system that works properly, well, that is a priority. So I think that we need to be very vigilant when it comes to how to build a stack that doesn't replicate the same problems of the US and Chinese-led stacks. I'm just clicking to arrive to my final slide. And it's not enough to build data centers, but we still need to have our own. I arrived there. Okay. So, and I think, and I will add something to the stack discussion, which is that the agenda matters. The research agenda, the technological agenda. What are the needs of that population? Because one could ask, for instance, do we need generative AI models? For what purposes? Aren't there other AI models, machine learning models that could be more fit for purpose? Does a small peasant in the middle of Africa need generative AI? Believe me, I don't think so, but I am not the one who should make that call. And this is also why I tend to disagree a bit with the idea of as a Latin American, with the idea of Europe bringing me their technology. It can be built with all the love and care, but it will still be your technology. It will still be a technology that whose agenda is not set by the priorities of the population of the country where it's going to be sold. So I think that the first question that above all needs to be about research and technological agenda. Of course, always keeping it within planetary boundaries. We cannot afford ourselves to build all the technology that we would want. The planet would not be able to fit all that technology. And when I think about Latin America, for instance, and I talk about Latin America because I know it more. I also talk about Europe because I do a lot of research here and I live here, but it might not be what, again, Africa or India or other parts of the world need. I definitely think we need to work together. I definitely think that part of the solution comes from minimum regulatory standards, for instance, in relation to the data centers that are already installed in our territories. And we need to build a collective public alternative, at least for the public sector. So what I started doing was to think, okay, where can we start building this? Do we have capabilities? Because the typical answer is no capabilities. You don't have the capacity to do it. You don't have the money to do it. So let's just give it all to the companies. I think that we can already start by what it exists in Latin America. For instance, Antel is a state-owned company from Uruguay. It operates 2 of the 3 data centers in the country. A very small country, Uruguay, very peripheral, and still 2 of the 3 data centers in the country. Antel is also the responsible for the fiber optics in the country. Uruguay is a country with 95% of the population with access to internet through fiber optics, thanks to Antel. Then Argentina has ARSAT. Yes, of course, Milei is completely destroying ARSAT. ARSAT produces satellites and is capable to launching satellites. Yes, of course, also not necessarily the ultimate technology in satellites, but good enough to have satellites and be able to get data through the satellites and so on in the whole territory. Chile developed something that is extremely interesting and relevant for the discussions about data center beyond the alternative of the stack, also to regulate the companies. The previous Chilean government built what they describe as a heat map that basically plots over 80 socio-environmental variables to make sure that they can then develop a sort of indication urban planning for the building of data centers, for the installation of data centers, where it is possible to build a data center and where it should be forbidden. This goes both, this can be both a useful tool for a company like Antel when it starts doing public knowledge transfer with other countries to build their data centers, but also to regulate the private sector. And then, just to give you one example from Brazil, but Brazil has many more things, has state-owned software companies and a lot of other things. But I wanted to also highlight that Latin America, for instance, has a lot of AI scientists. So these people could be put at the service of creating and developing alternatives. And they should definitely work together with Europeans, with Africans, with Asians, and so on and so forth. This shouldn't be just thought as a solution for one region or one region at a time. And then I think that all this effort needs to be channeled towards a specific priority. One common goal to build a complete alternative stack, a complete alternative ecosystem for one specific sector within the public administration, because there we can guarantee procurement. So if on the basis of this, we create an alternative set of interconnected digital infrastructures, we can totally have a lot of markets that will then be developing, and a lot of also open source and digital common solutions that will be developing all the other services and pieces, because also Latin America has a lot of companies that are doing it, but that could also be offered as well by the European SMEs and so on. So this is a bit what I would have in mind for a region like Latin America.
Great. I sensed some disagreement with Sebastiano, so give him the...
Just to respond to Cecilia, but of course also to your question, to make sure I'm not misunderstood.
That's great.
Of course, as a European, and as representative of business interest, I obviously want our companies to export to Latin America, to Africa, and so on. But what I'm keen to say here, what I was keen to say is it's not necessarily exporting products or services, it's exporting the model. Because the model, if you think about it, the model is about how Latin America or Africa or another region can build their own stack, not by creating a state subsidized industry champion that will do everything from A to Z, but rather from supporting the aggregation of technology solutions that probably already exist in Latin America as well as in Africa, certainly they do in Europe. So I'm very glad if Latin America can build their own stack and then perhaps even export it to Europe and give us, a good success story of what it is. The fact is that all of this is only possible if we have a very good alignment between the public and the private sector. It is very obvious to me that looking at Europe, which is the ecosystem I know, the market in Europe is highly fragmented. So we have really thousands and thousands of companies, and even if you take the largest of our companies, they are not nearly large enough to try to compete alone with big tech. So the market will not be able to deliver an alternative to the dominance we have at the moment unless the market gets a very clear indication by the state. So what we need is a very good, strong public-private alignment in order to create the alternative technology that as people, as citizens, as individuals, we would like to have. To respond to your question on the cloud, because you asked what is that we should be doing to create a cloud, I can tell you what I think we should be doing in Europe, and I think the model could work also elsewhere. We don't need, once again, to create the European champion. This is what maybe Merz and Macron want, and I can tell you already it will fail. What we can do is the model of federation. Federation means that we have already a lot of cloud providers of mid-size, mid scale, which don't need to become the European champion, but each of them can work with the others. We have done that. It's not a dream. We have done exactly that in 1987. It was the largest success we could do as Europeans, which was so-called the GSM, when the telco operators decided to create a sort of global federation and use one single standard all around the world and agree on a revenue sharing business model. What I mean is that if you are, imagine you are, I don't know, Telecom Italia, because I'm Italian, and you want to serve your customers when they go to Germany or France, do you have to build antennas in Germany or France? Actually, no, because you will use the antennas provided by Deutsche Telekom or by Orange, okay? Why? Because you use the same standard and then you share the revenues. And guess what? We could do exactly the same in the cloud computing. When there is a peak of demand in my cloud, my national cloud or wherever, the cloud is not big enough to serve me because that day I have a lot of requests, well, they will simply send my request to the cloud, to the data center in another country. And that's it. And by doing so, we can resolve all the scalability problem that the Americans tell, you are not big enough to compete with us. It's very simple. We have done that in the past. But to conclude, this will never happen because we've been talking to the cloud providers and they will not do it unless the political power tells them to do so. Because there is a market failure, there is too much market fragmentation, the market will not solve this by themselves. They need government to take leadership.
Great, thank you. Melody, please.
Yes, so I'm coming from another event. I was at the European Commission, and it was an event on EU, Africa on AI, and looking, of course, at issues around investments and partnerships. So I think what's just listening to the deliberations during the event, what kept coming up was we need more investments and we need to partner. So I think when we are thinking about the AI stack, issues around investments are quite critical. So yes, we know we need compute power. We know we need meaningful connectivity. We know we need digital infrastructure, skilling of the population, and. But where is the money going to come from to actually do all these things? So I think when we talk about the AI stack, the issue of partnerships becomes critical. And for Africa, I think what some countries have been doing was really how to manage and navigate the tension, especially between the US and China. So a lot of our hard infrastructure is still from the likes of Huawei and a lot of Chinese companies. We've actually invested a lot in hard infrastructure. And of course, the likes of Google, Microsoft, they've been in this space and they are actually supporting a lot of research and development in the space. And for Europe, I wanted to comment with the Europe Tech Business Offer that usually, well, in the early stages, they were coming in as the regulatory superpower, coming with their ideas of how to govern and how to regulate using this human-centric approach to digital transformation. And I think for the longest, as far as data protection was concerned, a lot of countries just started trying to imitate and to copy what the EU was doing, because at the time, I don't think we had that leverage and the power to actually resist, because that's how things were. And I remember I was still working in South Africa at the time in the private sector. We had so many local companies that were not even trading in Europe coming asking us, how do we comply with the GDPR? Because everyone was talking about the GDPR. And fast forward to now, things are changing. We are realizing, even with Europeans, you are realizing that this regulated approach and being too strict doesn't work. So now there's, a lot of countries are now looking back to say, okay, maybe regulation is not a top priority for us, which is why you see a lot of African countries haven't really regulated AI. So before they jumped to have frameworks on data protection. But now with artificial intelligence, it's a different story altogether. They're taking their time in terms of coming up with national strategies to actually develop things that make sense for them and to have frameworks that make sense for them. So just to comment again on the issue of investments, I know the EU, there was the global gateway as an investment package, and I think it was like 300 million that was going towards Africa. But then again, when you look at how they come up with some of these offers, it was never in consultation with African stakeholders. So it's more like the EU come, they do their thing and say, okay, this is what we want to offer. And then try to panel bit it to fit into the priorities that African countries might have, which doesn't always work, and hence this conversation about mutual benefits and mutually beneficial partnership. What does that even mean when you are developing strategies that impact Africans, you are not having them in the room? So I think issue of investments is quite critical, and a lot of African governments, they are really navigating this tension. They are still having partnerships with US companies, still in partnership with European companies, with Chinese companies, because at the end of the day, like I said, for us, it's not about who is winning the AI race. It's about what value can we get from all this AI development. And coming to the question of procurement from a more practical example as well, yes, when you talk to policymakers, they talk a lot about AI sovereignty and the need to not heavily rely on foreign firms, especially big tech. But in practice, it's a very different story, because most of these are big tech, and by hyperscalers, they are the ones that dominate the market. So you can't just wake up one day as a government and you kick Microsoft or Google out. That's going to take a lot of time. And I think the conversation there should start focusing on how can these hyperscalers and big tech actually partner with local players. So if there is a framework, I know with South Africa, they have been trying to work around this to find ways in which there is partnership between locally owned firms plus international firms, so that at the end of the day, there is knowledge transfer or tech transfer over the years. I know it's not going to happen overnight or in a decade, but it's a conversation that is worth having as we go forward.
Thanks, a lot of interesting points. I want to get a sense of how many questions we have, so that, yeah, you have one there, one there, one there. David, do you want to react quickly to what I said before I turn it over to them? Please, short, because we don't have much time.
Yeah, very quickly. I just want to kind of throw a provocation out there that maybe we don't need AI. You know, kind of building on this, right?
That's a good conclusion. Could keep for last.
Yeah, no, just stick with me for a minute, because we're talking about, you know, the time to disentangle ourselves from big cloud and big tech was 10, 15 years ago. And the kind of stack we need, I would say we're forcing the question onto, we want to build a particular vision of AI, and therefore we need a particular kind of stack. Whatever technological choices we're making are going to have path dependencies and are going to be very difficult to roll back, and they'll have downstream effects. AI systems, as we're currently conceptualizing them as like systems that require hard compute, that are like incredibly massive, are inherently going to be difficult to govern democratically. And so we should try to imagine maybe a different ecosystem of what AI could look like, right? Small compute, small models, those that don't necessarily require massive data center investments. And there's possibly, you know, I think we need a wholesale kind of reimagination, and it's not that difficult, but you know, AI in this current framing of AI as large language models, which is the way we're using it, is a fairly new phenomenon, although it's been in the making for many years. So I think it is possible to start rolling that back, and you know, I wanted to bring up that anecdote which I used from a fairly famous paper by Langdon Winner called "Do Artifacts Have Politics?" Right, and he confronts us with this question of we can make a choice for energy dependency between nuclear power and solar power, right? Nuclear power is going to require highly centralized systems of governance and highly centralized safety procedures. Or we could go with solar power, which is a far more kind of democratic and more widespread, system for energy, which doesn't necessarily have the same dependencies. And I think this is our moment for thinking about whether in the AI space, do we want nuclear power? Do we want solar power? Right?
Very well put. Okay, please.
Yeah, it works.
Yes, can you please state your name and affiliation?
Peter from Open Mind Foundation. We develop open source software for AI. Okay. So my question is about open source. So we've talked about open source, but I've been long enough around because in Europe we've been talking for open source. Yet all the public administrations runs on Windows for the last 20 years. And don't tell me that there's no open source software available. Today you can have on Linux the same quality that you can get on Windows. Yet nothing happens. So why would it be different in your country? We've been trying, we've been failing, to be frank. Yeah? And now, even on the AI front, we have Chinese open source models. You have American ones, you have European ones. So I think it's a political problem. I don't think it's an investment problem.
Great, thank you.
I disagree.
Massimo.
Marcel Colaya, Access Now. I have a question for Sebastiano, and that is, you spoke about the, let's say, alternative cloud model. So practically speaking, what do you see as a regulatory or legislative vehicle that could deliver this change? Because you said that it's basically a problem of the legislation that doesn't require this. Is it the DMA, or does DMA need to go via a review, or does it need to be a completely new legislative initiative? How do you see this?
There was one there. We'll collect one more.
Good afternoon. Guy Banim. I work with Build Up, which is basically Kenya, Global South, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and so on. Access Now we often work with, and many others in this space. I want to say, first of all, thank you very much for a brilliant panel. I really wish that some of this voice had been in some of the other panels I've been in the last couple of days, because I was on a panel earlier today. I don't know if anyone was in that discussion, but it was about how can we have digital sovereignty for Europe to help Europe, and the kind of, there's a kind of global discussion about this that I think we really need to have. So this is exactly the discussion I think was brilliant. And I align myself with a lot of the things that were said. But just on this thing about, do we really need AI, was exactly, Cecilia was provocatively, does somebody in an African context really need this? I mean, we work in Sudan, I'm going to Guinea-Bissau in a couple of weeks' time, where I've worked in the past. I've lived in Cabo Verde. We have this problem of the drug pushers, yeah? I mean, it's like the opium wars. People in rural villages in Africa are getting hooked onto the large language models because it's being pushed in there, as it was with WhatsApp is free, and I think one of you mentioned this. So I tend to agree with you. We in Build Up, we want to build locally relevant solutions to digital peace builders that meet their needs, and all this discussion, I hope that Europe can, and the European Commission is helping us to do that, and we hope in a way that delivers what African, Afghans, or Somalis actually need. But we really have this problem when the Guinea-Bissau counterparts I'm working with, they want us to come with the latest LLM-based sense-making technology that will help them to analyze the root causes of the conflict. So maybe they don't need it, but they've got this expectation now plugged in. So how do we kind of make sure that we keep the space open for the open source, federated, locally relevant, locally built solution?
Okay, some hard questions here. Anyway, we have 7 minutes, so please try to...
I can take the question
please.
For me, if you like, because it was very clear. How do we procure the cloud, essentially, you were asking, or how do we make the law such that we get the cloud that I was dreaming about? Well, it's not the DMA, to be very frank with you. I don't think the DMA is going to solve much. I mean, I love the DMA, but we have seen how difficult it is to implement it, and I don't dream that the Commission will have the guts to really do what they need to do. But there is a solution, which is, if you like, broadly speaking, I will call about industrial policy. There is a very simple way to essentially, what you can do is to mandate the procurement, the public procurement of federated and interoperable solutions. Okay, so if you have to decide top down, okay, when we buy cloud, we will only allow cloud services which come from companies which are established in Europe, which the data centers are in Europe, and which comply with this interoperability standard ABCD. We don't need to decide it now, but the public authority has to decide it. If they do so, they will obviously favor certain companies, which are going to be European and which will want to work together. And the beautiful thing is that this is not very different from what has just happened in the very well-known cloud procurement contract, which was awarded like a couple of weeks ago by the Commission for their own cloud, where the people in the Commission, they were very clever. They are not always, but in this case, they were super clever because they wrote the tender specification in a way which essentially forced those who were going to answer into creating, first of all, not one single cloud provider, but 4 different consortia, and 4 consortia made by several players, which means they forced federation into the companies, and they obviously had sovereignty criteria. So at large, you can say most of the providers were European. Okay, there is some stack provided by Google. Okay, but overall, I think they made a good thing, and it was not even a law. This was just soft power, Commission using their own procurement power. So imagine if you put those principles in a law for public procurement in Europe, you will change the market. As simple as that.
Thank you. Just to add one bit to that, interoperable, but also open source, to go back to it, because open source would allow, that's a submission that I would make, because it would allow auditability, it would allow transparency to understand the security aspects of it. If it's just interoperable, but you have no way to know how it works.
Here it's a big topic, but I will just say I'm a big fan of open source, and we think there's not going to be any sovereignty in Europe and elsewhere without open source, for sure. But that said, mandating that only open source is sovereign is a big mistake. Because you are, if you do that, you're going to cut out of the market 80% of the providers, and you're going to use only 20% of it.
But yeah, thank you.
Also, just to enter into the conversation, I think that we shouldn't think that auditing an algorithm is the same as having an open source algorithm. Actually, the AI models are allegedly open source and they cannot be audited. So I think that definitely it is possible for the one that purchases the software, especially if it's for the public sector, to audit, which means seeing the code and being able to influence it without making the code public for everyone. So I think that we can work on solutions. But I want to answer very fast to the other questions. People want AI. Yes, indeed. And people want big tech. So I think that this is why we need to start by the public sector. We need to build a prototype, something that works. The public sector must use open source. Of course, and I also agree with you, this is a political above an investment problem. Why? Because Europe found money to invest in defense like this. It found that there was a problem, and then they started investing millions and millions. So clearly, when the political will is there, the money is also there. And then I think that I agree that because adoption is incredibly fast, we cannot just simply wait until the prototype is created. What we need is AI regulation. I strongly disagree with what African countries are doing. If you want to keep something from all this and all the learnings, is that you do need regulation. The problem is that you really need to think carefully about what type of regulation and how you regulate. And then I would finalize by saying that we still need, we confuse sometimes the data center as the digital infrastructure with the role that the cloud plays. If you want your all different components, Stefano, to work as multiple markets and interconnected, you are calling for a cloud. You are calling for one single digital space where everything can be interconnected. That will provide private companies a lot of power, just like the companies from the US and China, specifically the US, have today. Which is why I think that the solution is not about public-private alignment in abstract terms. It's about identifying where we need a state-owned company or set of state-owned companies offering, granting that part of the stack operates as a public utility and where we can have competitive markets. Because the solution to monopolies is not always competition. When the monopoly is a natural monopoly, the solution is different. And this is what happens with the cloud.
Fantastic. Yeah, Melody, please react.
Just to react to the issue of regulation. So just to clarify, we do have some sort of regulation. So we have regulation specifically on personal data and regulation on non-personal data, but not something specifically on artificial intelligence.
This was my point.
Yes.
The companies don't want the governments to regulate. They want to do themselves the regulation, like AI safety, AI responsible, blah, blah. But AI should be regulated by an independent actor, and the public sector should be accountable.
So I think the problem that we've had in the past, just looking at how we came up with our data protection laws, was there was no proper consultative process. It's different from here in Europe, where it takes years before you actually have a regulatory framework. So at the moment, what we have is the continental AI strategy, which also points to the need for the continent and for countries to actually have regulation at some point. But I'm just saying, for now, I don't think regulating is the priority for African countries. We have low-hanging fruit, which is the data protection laws that we have and other legal frameworks that are already in place. But the problem is there is no way to enforce. So we could have an AI law that's not going to be enforceable. And just to react to the LLM question, maybe we can have a chat after this. But there is a big community called Masakan. I don't know if you've heard about Masakan or Lelapa AI community, who are also building a lot of large language models using African languages. So I think that's one way of also trying to support African communities. And from the discussions that I've had, there's a lot of impact in also attending a lot of these conferences, especially the deep learning in Daba. It takes place, I think, every year. That's where actually a lot of innovators actually come together and SMEs come together and network with our investors. So just something to add to the conversation.
Right. Final word also to David.
Sure. Thank you. Just on the last bit, I think, I do think, despite all my criticism of how digital sovereignty has panned out, that sovereignty is also a tactic, especially for civil society, to start to enter these debates and start to shape them in particular ways. I think one tactic is to really call out the fact that a lot of our current AI ecosystem is built on lies and deep discounts, and that it is fundamentally unsustainable. In the long run, the plan for all of these companies is to make you structurally dependent on them and then raise the costs exponentially so that you can't pay them. An example from last week is a Microsoft data center in Kenya that basically held the government to blackmail and said that unless you have a specific revenue sharing agreement with us, we're going to pack up this big investment that you've already made in our system, right? So once you have those forms of structural dependency, it's much more difficult for you to back out of them. This is the lesson from the past 15 years of platform dynamics in the information economy. And so again, I call for a rethink of how we try to shape these things. I think as a final point, I'm a big critic, and like to critically think about digital public infrastructure, but the idea of publicly funded, a public option, so to say, of what infrastructure looks like is an interesting and good idea, has been done in the past, is being thought of currently, and I think as long as it's not forced down people's throats as it currently is, I think it's a good way to go about developing digital infrastructure. Yeah.
Perfect. So thank you very much. Just the concluding remark on the cloud open source thing. The cloud security framework that was adopted by the European Union, it has some elements that are used for preferential contracting of certain players, including if they align with the regulatory values and so on. So it does not need to be mandated, it can be a preference. And then final point, if you liked this discussion, we have dedicated CPDP Latam to interoperable sovereignty, interoperable and cooperative sovereignty. So the idea is really to try to see how we can create also an international framework to foment a more informed and precise discussion about this concept that has been chasing us in the past couple of days. So with that, please join me in thanking the panelists for the terrific discussion.